All right, I want to talk about the differences between World War I and World War II. When you think about popular culture, you think about the World War I, you've got this mental image of the Western Front with the trenches and endless firing from the trenches and charges over the top and some sort of senseless slaughter without much being accomplished. It just dragged on for years and years. But when you think of World War II, you tend to think of armies racing across France or Russia or Poland, and you think of Blitzkrieg and you think of all this motion. And I wanted to talk about why that difference happened. What was the big difference? And the real difference is there are two, and they both come down to technology. One is transportation technology and one is weapons technology. So let's look at the two together. World War I. Automobiles were invented by World War I, and they were used, but they were not in widespread use, and they were not reliable enough to be used for heavy-duty military transport, etc. They just simply weren't that common, and the roads weren't that good. And so most of World War I, there were three modes of transportation. There were horses pulling military carts, etc. There were trains, which had limited locations they could go to, and then there was foot. And in fact, most of World War I, armies marched on foot. They marched for miles and miles on foot. So the transportation in World War I was shaky. Now, yes, there were airplanes, but the airplanes were very lightweight and they couldn't carry a whole lot of payload. And so really it was trains, horses, and foot. The second big thing in World War I is weapons. Now, World War I, there had been a number of weapons that had been invented in the latter half of the 19th century, and these would transform the nature of modern warfare. The first of these is the machine gun. The machine gun, the Gatling gun, had been invented in the American Civil War, and that was a hand-cranked machine gun, basically. But by the 1870s and 80s, the true machine gun was perfected. Now, a machine gun can shoot 9 to 12 bullets a second, but it's a much bigger and heavier weapon than we think of as a machine gun today. A machine gun in World War I was about 90 pounds. It was a big weapon, and it got super hot when you used it, so you couldn't really pick it up and run with it. But most importantly, it used so much ammunition that essentially you needed three people to operate it. You needed one guy firing the machine gun and aiming it, one guy feeding ammunition into the machine gun, and then one guy running back and forth getting more ammunition because the gun went through so much ammunition so fast. All of that meant that the machine gun was a fantastic defensive weapon. If someone was attacking your position, you could mow down attacking soldiers with no problem with a machine gun, and the ammunition was not a problem because you were in your trench, etc. You had your stockpiles, etc. But it was not an offensive weapon. To move it, you had to take it apart and disassemble it, and it was hot, and you had to carry it, and it took 2 or 3 guys to carry all the stuff, and then you had to set it up again before you could fire, and the net result was that it was not a good offensive weapon. You couldn't go attack an enemy with a machine gun. You could defend yourself if they attacked very effectively, but you couldn't go attack. Second big invention was high explosive artillery. Up until the American Civil War, cannons were basically firing something solid. They were firing cannonballs, they were firing grape shot, which is sort of buckshot for cannons. And they were simply propelling metal at high speeds. But in the latter half of the 19th century, with the invention of nitroglycerin, you could get high explosive artillery shells. These are shells where the cannon would send them to a target, and when they landed, they exploded. This could be an offensive weapon in the sense that artillery can fire long distances, and if you have the right targeting, you can go right at an enemy, and then if the enemy moves, you can move your artillery targeting and hit them again and again. You can bombard a specific place to attack it. But in World War I, they had a problem with that, and the problem was that they didn't have good communications. The radios were shaky, unreliable, and easily broken and damaged. They tried telephone wires, but those get blown up by artillery shells. And so basically, the only way they could do communication was somebody running back and forth. And so what you basically had was somebody up at the front. The artillery was a mile or 2 behind the lines. They would fire at the enemy lines. Somebody up at the front would say, oh, you're 100 yards too short. You need to go 100 yards farther. They had to run 2 miles back to the artillery, tell them that, and then come back up and watch again to see how the sighting was working. It worked, but it was very clumsy. third big weapon that was invented was airplanes, but airplanes were not really a factor in World War I because they were still in their infancy. They were only invented in the 10 years earlier, and they were lightweight. They could not carry a lot of payload, and so they really couldn't deliver weapons. They couldn't deliver firepower. They attached machine guns to them so you could strafe enemy lines. They were useful for reconnaissance, but they couldn't carry a bomb payload big enough to make much difference. At the beginning of the war, guys were throwing hand grenades out of the cockpit, and even at the end of the war, they had very small bombs that 50-pound bombs that were not going to do a whole lot of damage. Artillery was much more effective. And then finally, tanks. Tanks were invented during World War I, but they really were not effective in World War I. The initial idea was that a tank was going to be a bulletproof box that you could wheel up to an enemy machine gun so you could attack it. And so tanks were basically big armored boxes that had very light armaments, a machine gun or two on them. And they were clumsy, they broke down a lot, they were slow, they were extremely hard to work with. And in trench warfare, they're kind of problematic because they had a hard time getting over trenches. And so the tank was used in World War I. It was not really an effective weapon. The result of all of this is that in World War I, you had fantastic defensive weapons. Artillery is actually a defensive weapon also because you can pre-sight right in front of your lines and shower a particular area with artillery as a defensive tactic. It works great for that, and you don't need sighting or anything. And machine guns are a great defensive weapon. But the only offensive weapon they had was heavy artillery barrage, and then a whole bunch of guys, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, jumping out of the trenches with semi-automatic rifles and bayonets and charging at the enemy lines. This was suicide because you're talking about tens of thousands of guys charging into machine guns, they're charging into artillery fire, they're charging into barbed wire, etc. But that was the best offensive weapon they had. That was the only way they had to attack the enemy lines. And so the net result, especially when you had two equal armies like on the Western Front, was stasis, right? The British and the French and the Germans sat there for 4 years blasting away at each other and causing senseless slaughter without moving the lines much because they didn't have good offensive weapons. In fact, the British set up monuments to the first and last British soldiers, English soldiers killed in World War I, and they're only 2 miles apart. The guy who died on the first day of the war and the guy who died on the last day of the war died about 2 miles apart. In fact, they're buried in the same cemetery. The war was not a war of motion. But if you turn to World War II, all of that changes. First of all, by World War II, you had much better automobiles, Jeeps basically. You had trucks that were much more reliable. You had better roads. So transportation was done by internal combustion engine. It was motorized transportation, which was much faster. You could move troops around faster. You could move supplies faster. Second, the weapons in World War II had been perfected. First of all, the tank. By World War II, the tank has a cannon on it. It's got a turret. It's an extremely effective offensive weapon. They're pretty fast. They're fairly agile. You can send tanks at the enemy and blast away at things. So it's a way of attacking enemy lines. Second, you have airplanes that have improved. You have dive bombers. Now, a dive bomber is an airplane, flies about 35,000 feet with a single 500-pound bomb, and it dives at its target. And the pilot basically pretends he's going to fly his plane straight into whatever he wants to hit on the ground, but then he drops his bomb and then pulls out, and the bomb goes exactly where he aimed it. It's an extremely accurate way of dropping a 500-pound bomb, which is a significant explosive device. And so if you got squadrons of dive bombers coming in one after another, you could pummel an enemy position with 500-pound bombs over and over again. And of course, this is what the Germans turned into Blitzkrieg, which is where they would line up several hundred tanks and they'd pummel a position on the enemy lines with dive bombers and then drive hundreds of tanks through the resulting hole in the lines. This is really effective. This is offensive weapons. These are things that you can deliver firepower at the enemy heavily. But there are a couple other ones that were important. First of all, there were heavy bombers. By World War II, you've got the B-17s, the B-24s, who can drop thousands of pounds of bombs on enemy lines because they're huge airplanes and they can carry thousands of pounds of payload. This means you can attack the enemy, not very accurately because you're dropping the bombs from 30,000 feet and they drift a lot. There's a lot of things that can happen on the way down. But you can bomb cities, you can attack. Second, machine guns had improved. By World War II, you actually have several forms of submachine guns which are carryable. You can carry them, infantry soldiers can carry them. You had lightweight carbines that fire a fairly small bullet, but they can fire rapidly, and they have a clip which can hold a lot of ammunition, so you don't have to reload as often as the World War I rifles. And then you have things like the Browning automatic rifle, which is basically a full machine gun that you can that it's light enough to carry, and a single soldier can carry it. And so all of these weapons meant that you could now deliver firepower at the enemy in a way much more effectively than you could in World War I. The results are exactly what we see. In World War I, you had stasis, people were digging trenches, they were just sending waves of infantry ineffectively at each other's lines because they had no good offensive weapons. In World War II, you have a plethora of offensive weapons. You've got tanks, you've got dive bombers, you've got infantry with machine guns. You can deliver firepower at the enemy way more effectively. And the result is that it was easier to break through enemy lines, and then the transportation differences, the trucks, the tanks, the jeeps, etc., meant that armies could move quickly, and so World War II became a war of motion in a way that World War I never could have been, and it's really because of the weapons. If you like this video, please subscribe and check out our other videos. Thank you.